Kicking off the event is Singapore's ambassador-at-large and former ambassador to the U.S., Professor Chan Heng-chi. Let's listen in.
To you, Vice President Harris, and your delegation. It is good to have you in Singapore. We are honored you have chosen Singapore to start your first visit to Asia and wish you a productive time during your stay with us. 2021 marks the 55th year of the establishment of Singapore-US bilateral relations and the 44th year of ASEAN-US dialogue relations. In 2015, we renamed the dialogue relations a strategic partnership. This was marked by the Sunnylands Summit the following year in 2016, hosted by President Barack Obama. While dates are important milestones that punctuate a relationship, the United States has been a long-standing partner of Singapore and the region. The American presence in the Asia-Pacific since the end of World War II enabled countries in the region to grow in peace and stability. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's founding father, reminded Americans and the region that the US presence in Vietnam bought precious time for countries in Southeast Asia to build their political institutions and strengthen economic development. It also enabled Southeast Asia to get its act together to lay the foundation for ASEAN, a critical pillar of regional stability and prosperity. Between Singapore and the United States, good relations are the norm, bad relations the exception. Our good relations are built on substantive interests in the two-way trade and investment, defense and security cooperation, technology cooperation, education cooperation, the digital economy, global health, and climate change. COVID-19 has slowed travel, but I know many young Singapore students would want to study in the United States, in your best universities, once the pandemic has stabilized. There is much we can learn from the United States: innovation, creativity, the entrepreneurial spirit, and the inquiring spirit. We can learn a great deal about building an innovation ecosystem that stimulates the economy. In the 16 years I spent in the United States as Singapore's ambassador to Washington, I have learned much about the resilience of the American economy and political system. I watched the country bounce back from the global financial crisis in 2009, slowly, not completely, but faster than generally expected. Dow started climbing in 2013, and thereafter with ups and, of course, a few downs. The last record Dow high was July 26, 2021, closing at 35,144.31 points. Vice President Harris, your visit is timely and will signal continued American commitment to the region. You have come to the region at an interesting time. Before the pandemic, regional countries were doing well with respectable to high growth rates. Many smaller and medium countries were beginning to feel a sense of achievement and agency. But the pandemic has wounded many countries in ASEAN and weakened economies globally. At the same time, we are aware of the rapidly increasing tensions in US-China relations, which impacts on us all. In recent days, we have been watching the unfolding events in Afghanistan. So, it is with the greatest interest that we wait to hear your views on the US role in the Asia-Pacific, or as many now increasingly call it, the Indo-Pacific. Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted and honored to introduce the first woman Vice President of the United States, and the first person of African American and Indian heritage to achieve this position, Vice President Kamala Harris.
And good morning to everyone. It is a joy and an honor to be with you today and to be here in Singapore. And Ambassador, you mentioned it. You ended your comments with this, and I will begin my comments. I'm speaking about Afghanistan because I am fully aware that as I stand here today, the eyes of many around the world are on Afghanistan. So before I begin my comments, I will talk about that. You all know we were at war in Afghanistan for 20 long years. Many members of our military gave their lives in Afghanistan, as did many from our allies and partners. Months ago, President Joe Biden made the courageous and right decision to end this war because we had achieved what we went there to do. Over these past weeks, the United States has been focused on safely evacuating American citizens, international partners, Afghans who worked side by side with us, and other Afghans at risk. We are laser focused on the task at hand, and we are extremely grateful to our men and women in uniform and embassy staff who are on the ground as we speak, making this historic airlift happen in an incredibly difficult and dangerous environment. And we are grateful to our international partners for standing with us and working with us to meet this challenge, including Singapore. At the same time, it is also imperative that as we address developments in one region, we continue to advance our interest in other regions, including this region. And that brings me to why I'm here today in Singapore. As I've said many times over these past many months, the fact is that I believe our world is embarking on a new era, an era with new challenges like cybersecurity, and an era with new opportunities like clean energy. The fact is our world is more interconnected and interdependent. And in order then to embrace this new era, nations must be willing to take on challenges together and create opportunities together. That is why our partnerships in Singapore, in Southeast Asia, and throughout the Indo-Pacific are a top priority for the United States. The United States is a proud part of the Indo-Pacific, and this region is critically important to our nation's security and prosperity. Just consider, some of our closest allies and strongest partners are here. Our exports to the region support 4 million American jobs. And in 2019, the United States conducted nearly $2 trillion of two-way trade here, all of which underscores America's connection to the Indo-Pacific. In this region, we have long put forward a vision of peace and stability, freedom on the seas, unimpeded commerce, advancing human rights, a commitment to the international rules-based order, and the recognition that our common interests are not zero-sum. Now, as we face threats to that order, I am here to reaffirm our commitment to that vision. to strengthen it, and to make sure it addresses the challenges of today and of tomorrow. To do that, we will invest our time and our energy to fortify our key partnerships, including with Singapore and Vietnam. Our partnerships will be grounded in candor, openness, inclusiveness, shared interests, and mutual benefits. The United States will pursue a free and open Indo-Pacific that promotes our interests and those of our partners and allies. In addition to deepening close bilateral relations, we will also work multilaterally through long-standing institutions like ASEAN, which remains central to this region's architecture. We will also work with new results-oriented groups like the Quad and the U.S.-Mekong Partnership. And we will always be true to our values and support those who seek a better future for all people. I believe that when the history of the 21st century is written, much of it will be centered right here in the Indo-Pacific. Our intention is to strengthen our partnerships and reinforce our shared vision so that the United States, with our partners, can together continue shaping that history. In doing so, there should be no doubt, we have enduring interests in this region, and we have enduring commitments as well. Those commitments include, of course, security. Yesterday, I visited Changi Naval Base. The U.S. Navy ship, the USS Tulsa, is docked there right now, a symbol of a deep and enduring security partnership between our nations, a statement of America's security commitment to this region. Our vision includes freedom of navigation, which is vital to us all. The livelihood of millions of people depend on the billions of dollars in trade that flow through these sea lanes each day. And yet, in the South China Sea, we know that Beijing continues to coerce, to intimidate, and to make claims to the vast majority of the South China Sea. These unlawful claims have been rejected by the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal decision. And Beijing's actions continue to undermine the rules-based order and threaten the sovereignty of nations. The United States stands with our allies and partners in the face of these threats. And I must be clear, our engagement in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific is not against any one country, nor is it designed to make anyone choose between countries. Instead, our engagement is about advancing an optimistic vision that we have for our participation and partnership in this region. And our economic vision is a critical part of that. The economy of the United States is growing faster than it has in nearly 40 years. Wages are up, employment is up, consumer demand is up, and we believe that our growth should not stop at the water's edge, that it can also, and it will also, benefit our partners. And our economy shares so much with Southeast Asia, from supply chains to a steady flow of two-way trade. Collectively, the nations of Southeast Asia represent our nation's fourth largest export market, a vibrant and dynamic market, which will soon rank among the biggest markets in the world. our trade relationships in Southeast Asia support more than 600,000 American jobs. And now, with an eye toward the future, we are strengthening our economic engagement. In fact, today I am proud to announce that the United States is offering to host APEC in 2023. Through APEC, or the Asian-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, the United States has long worked with our partners in Asia and Latin America to build an interconnected region that advances our collective economic prosperity. A vital part of our agenda is also related to addressing the climate crisis. Our vision includes investing in a clean energy future and building resilient communities. And the relationship between the United States and Singapore and its climate partnership that we announced yesterday will focus on sustainable finance as just one example of the work we are committed to doing together. The nations of Southeast Asia know the impact of the climate crisis all too well. The rising sea levels, the typhoons, the floods. These disasters have cost human life and livelihoods. And the crisis, as we know, the crisis, of course, is getting much more urgent. I'm sure many of you read and saw the report recently from the United Nations. And in our interconnected world, this issue affects us all, and it requires a collective vision, and it requires collective action. And then, of course, there's another issue that truly knows no borders, the pandemic. When President Joe Biden and I took office, we were determined not only to vaccinate our own nation, but to be an arsenal of safe and effective vaccines for our entire world. To date, of the 110 million doses we have shipped worldwide, we have delivered more than 23 million of those to Southeast Asia. And it is important to note that these are donations, free of charge, with no strings attached. Because for us, this is about saving lives, and because, of course, that is the right thing to do. Looking forward, our vision is a world where global health security is strengthened and where we can detect and attack new viruses early on. And we are taking steps to make that future a reality. In the same vein, I'd like to reiterate that we will continue to lead with our values. And that means respecting human rights at home and abroad. And to that end, I must say a word about Burma. The United States remains deeply alarmed by the military coup in Burma. We condemn the campaign of violent repression, and we are committed to supporting the people there as they work to return their nation to the path of democracy. And we do hope that nations throughout the Indo-Pacific will join us in that effort. Years from now, I hope we can all look back on this moment and say, this was when our region joined together to realize a better future. When we took action to improve the lives of all people. Years from now, I hope that we will be able to point to our partnerships between the United States and Singapore, between the United States and Southeast Asia, and throughout the Indo-Pacific, as the partnerships that made this shared vision of the future possible. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. That was U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris with her policy speech address in Singapore. A very quick sum up of that. She said she had to discuss Afghanistan because everyone is thinking of Afghanistan. But she used that issue to quickly move on to why it is also imperative that we address developments in one region. We must also address interests in other regions, and that's why she's here in Southeast Asia. She said the fact is the world is embarking on a new era, new challenges, new opportunities, such as clean energy. Nations, she said, like in this region and the US, must be ready to take on challenges together. Partners in Singapore, Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific, a top priority for the US. The region is critically important to security and prosperity in the United States. That the US has long put forward the vision of peace and stability and freedom on the seas. Of course, at this point, she moved on to essentially address the issue with China. She said, we are here to reaffirm our commitment to the vision of peace and stability and a free and open Indo-Pacific, and to strengthen that. She specifically mentioned that perhaps they would look at what has happened in terms of what Beijing has done. And I'll quote her specifically here. Freedom of navigation is in the South China Sea. Beijing continues to coerce, intimidate, and make claims to much of the South China Sea. This is unlawful, and Beijing's actions continue to undermine the rules-based international law. The U.S. stands with allies and partners in the face of these threats. She stressed the engagement in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific, not against any one country. That's rather not against China, or not to make anyone choose any one country. We're engaging, and it's about advancing an optimistic vision for our taking part in this region. It's across to Jeremy now, standing by. And Jeremy, you've listened to that speech. I think we can both agree Ms. Harris quickly took on the usual criticisms against Washington at this point, which is one, failure to engage economically with this region, and two, forcing countries in this region to choose between Washington and Beijing. Did you feel that as well?
Yes, indeed. I think she really addressed all the criticisms, as you said, about Washington's commitment to this region, especially in light of the chaotic withdrawal in Afghanistan. But the speech was pretty much short on specifics, except for a part where she criticized China. She said that China, claims in the South China Sea are unlawful, and that Beijing's actions continue to undermine the rules-based order and also threaten the sovereignty of nations, and that U.S. stands with allies and partners in the face of these threats. So, in other words, there's nothing much that's really illuminating about her speech here today. It's all themes that the Biden administration has been talking about since they took office, about this new renewed pivot to Asia. If you recall, the pivot to Asia was actually first mooted by Biden's former boss, President Obama, in 2009 when he took office then. Since then, we've seen how this pivot of Asia has played out. Obama wanted to pivot to Asia, but we've seen how he inherited two wars in Middle East, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and also how the Arab Spring took place in nations throughout Middle East as well as North Africa, and how he's been forced to realign his so-called pivot to Asia. And then we look at President Trump, who took office. He talked about the free and open Indo-Pacific, but he didn't really show up to this part of the world. He skipped the ASEAN summits for 3 times in a row, raising questions about the US's enduring commitment to this region. And of course, now we're looking at the chaotic pictures of America's chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, raising renewed questions about America's commitment here. Now, ostensibly, this withdrawal from Afghanistan is so that the U.S. could move their resources to this part of the world, Southeast Asia, as well as the Indo-Pacific, so that they can focus really on this part of the world. But there are questions on whether the U.S. will be able to do that, because in light of the poorly executed withdrawal from Afghanistan, there are questions about whether America can truly disengage from that region, from the Middle East, because there are fears, there are concerns that terrorist groups could once again, gain a foothold in Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover, and at some point in time, maybe the Biden administration or subsequent administrations will have to re-enter Afghanistan so as to counter the terrorist threat over there, just like what happened with Iraq and ISIS fighters.
Oh, Jeremy, we could look at that from several angles. So, for example, you're saying what we are seeing on our television screens. In fact, Singapore's Prime Minister mentioned that yesterday. He said, what we're looking at today, it's on TV, but what will influence how we see the United States is what happens in the future and whether it's able to stand firm on its priorities and its directions. So, for example, all right, we've got no news, in fact, out of Kamala Harris's visit. Sorry, Jeremy, cut to that right now.
House and the Biden administration. Let me introduce the three panelists who will discuss general issues of foreign policy and security, touching perhaps on the speech as well. I'll introduce our first panelist, Phil Gordon, Deputy NSC Advisor to the Vice President. He was Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs in the Obama administration first term. In the second term, he moved to NSC as the Special Assistant to the President and Coordinator for the Middle East, North Africa, and the Persian Gulf region. The second panelist, Edgar Kagan, who is the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for East Asia and Oceania, with jurisdiction over Northeast Asia, ex-China, and Southeast Asia. I understand this is new. Mr. Kagan has served in Korea and then returned in his earlier days to Washington and became the Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific in the Obama administration first term. Now, many of you here would be interested to know he was DCM in Kuala Lumpur, and he was DCM in Delhi before he took up this present position. The third panelist is Mr. Kin Moy. Mr. Moy is the Senior Bureau Official for the East Asia and Pacific Affairs in the State Department. If I may say, currently the sort of acting assistant secretary for East Asia and the Pacific, because the assistant secretary nominee is waiting to be confirmed. As usual, there's a bit of a hold-up by a senator. Prior to that, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Intelligence and Research in the State Department. Kin Moy has deep expertise in Asia, having served 29 years in the Foreign Service. He had postings in Beijing, Seoul, and Busan. And he was the director of the American Institute in Taiwan from 2015 to 2018, which means he was in Taiwan as a point person for the United States government. Now, with this excellent panel, let me begin the discussion. Right. And this question, I'll direct it to Mr. Gordon first, yeah? I've been asked, so I will ask you, how would you describe the significance of the Vice President's visit to Southeast Asia? The region has recently been visited by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and in July, and Secretary of State Antony Blinken, had a virtual meeting with the ASEAN foreign ministers in July, followed by a virtual attendance at the ASEAN ministers meeting, ARF-EAS, in August. How do you explain this sudden elevated attention to the region, and is there a new approach to security in Southeast Asia?
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me first start by saying it's such an honor to be in Singapore and a pleasure. I think I can say that not just for myself and my colleagues, but actually for the Vice President as well, which is related to your question. Her ability to travel is constrained by her responsibilities in Washington and now actually additionally in the Senate, which you referenced, but the 50-50 tie, the COVID situation. But when we talked about the fact that she might have a window for travel in August, she was very excited at the idea that it could be to this region and to Singapore in particular. And that's not sort of coincidental, but it partly answers your question, because she realizes, and as we all realize, the importance of this region, as she so eloquently stated just a few minutes ago. As for the way you framed the question about the sudden interest in this region, I would challenge. You know, we're only 8 months into this administration, and still early days. And I think we have tried to take a comprehensive approach to the vast Indo-Pacific. And so you mentioned some visits. Now, it's true early on that we had early bilateral summits with the leaders of the Republic of Korea and Japan, first bilateral visits in Washington. The Vice President met with those leaders herself. We've engaged extensively with the Quad, with an early summit at the leaders level, bringing India and Australia into that conversation. The Vice President actually engaged with those leaders as well. And we're trying to be comprehensive about this approach to a really vast and important region. And we see Southeast Asia at the heart of that region and want to make sure that it is a full part of our policy and our engagement. So you note that in addition to the engagements I just mentioned, there are obviously many, many more at many levels. We are making sure that our engagement in this region is commensurate with the interests we have at stake here. So I think, again, her presence here and what she had to say in this speech is the answer to your question. It's a core part of how we see this important region.
Well, thank you, Mr. Gordon, for reaffirming that. And in the course of the last couple of days and in the speech which the Vice President made this morning, I noticed there was emphasis on initiatives that have to do with functional relationships. There is a lot of that, pandemic cooperation, fintech, green tech, and so on. These are, to me, new initiatives. The traditional maritime security and concern about keeping sea lanes is something that has been emphasized throughout. But can I ask you, with the unfortunate images on television coming out from Afghanistan, do you think the Vice President, the USG, would have a harder time persuading countries to work with you? And, they may ask you, what will you do to show commitment? Now, I'm going to direct this to Mr. Moy.
Testing. Well, thank you very much for that question. And I also want to say how glad I am to be here. It has been a few years since I've been to Singapore. We're really deeply appreciative of the warm welcome that we received here. And to answer your question, Madam Ambassador, I think the United States is an Indo-Pacific nation. It is a geographic fact. It is a strategic reality. And so we have been committed for a long time. I mean, the Vice President alluded to it in her speech. She talked about how invested we have been here. And it's not about one country. It is defined by our interest in the future prospects. She talked about the interconnectedness, the interdependence, this new era. And it really is. It is an opportunity in the future. The United States is already invested in this region more than any other country in the world. If you look at foreign direct investment, if you look at the FDI numbers, if you look at how many jobs that we help create in the region, I think that the record, or the track record, is actually very, very good in the past. As Madam Vice President had mentioned, what we have done, our presence in this region has created an opportunity for all countries to thrive. And Ambassador, you mentioned it in your talk a little bit earlier about the Vietnam War and how the United States investment in Southeast Asia allowed for many countries to thrive here. And so I think the track record shows that we are committed. And as the Vice President has mentioned in her speech, we are looking at those future challenges too to create even more opportunities. And I think that you will see that in the future.
The other panelists can come in, and if you disagree, that's even better. Now, Phil, you wanted to say something.
I do want to come in, but not because I disagree, but I just want to add to it because you raise a really important point that, as you say, we're hearing a lot of, which is why I wanted to add a word about it.
Right.
I don't think that it is, I understand why people are asking the question.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's accurate to suggest that Afghanistan somehow shows the United States is not a reliable partner. In Afghanistan, we have spent 20 years with a lot of our international partners that included Singapore, spent more than $1 trillion, lost nearly 2,500 lives and tens of thousands of others wounded, sent a couple of generations of young service people to fight. It's not as if this was some fleeting commitment by the United States that it wasn't willing to back up. The president decided, and acknowledging that these are hard decisions, but he made a courageous decision to put this to an end, in part so that we can pursue our interests and focus on the things that matter to us. And that includes this region. And so I think a region in which, as we've said, we have been reliable partners for decades now, present, because it's in our interests. And again, I'll probably end up saying this throughout our panel, but the Vice President addressed this. We understand why our interests are so great here, and you can expect a country like the United States to pursue those interests, which makes it a reliable partner.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that actually, if you think about post-Vietnam, well, Singapore was one of the countries that said very consistently and often that the United States should leave a presence here. We hope you will not end your presence. If you think of post-Vietnam, well, after that, the Soviets went into Afghanistan, and Vietnam went into Cambodia. But I think during this time, I would add that no country thought that the United States, where would we swing? Would we leave the United States? They didn't think that, because it was a Cold War. Of course, times are different now, But the U.S. got back its mojo really at the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, when President Herbert Walker Bush created the coalition of the willing, and there was the to go against Iraq when Iraq walked into Kuwait. So I think I'm just I was thinking through this, and as someone in the region, how do you look on credibility and so on? So it's not just that because of Afghanistan, suddenly people swing. I don't think that happens. I'm just telling you now. That's my view. I think, Edgar, you were going to add something, but can I add another question to what you're about to say? What do you expect from the region, with the recommitment or the signal of commitment? What do you expect the regional countries to give or, work? What do you expect them to work with you on?
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and it is a tremendous honor to be here. But before getting to your question, which is an excellent one, I just wanted to add that there have been a number of times, you pointed to one, where there's been questions about the U.S. commitment and U.S. staying power. Another time was at the end of the Cold War. There were questions about what was the U.S. going to do. Those questions were repeated and have been a number of times since then, after the global financial crisis. I think this is something where there's been a very steady stream over the last 50 years of questions about the United States. And I think that the history suggests that we have been very clear. We understand what our interests are, we understand our commitments, and we also understand the importance of our alliances and our partnerships. And I think that this is something that is very much in our thinking as we recommit to them. And I think you've seen since the beginning of the administration, the president, the vice president, the senior leaders throughout the administration have been very clear about our focus on alliances and partnerships, because we understand that this is very much at the heart of how we must work with the world, but particularly with the Indo-Pacific region. Now, to your question about what we expect from the region, I think that it's very important to stress that we do not expect countries to act against their interests. What we are looking for is partnerships. We are looking to expand the range of things that we do together. And I think you heard in Vice President Harris's speech, we are looking for more areas in which we need to work together to deal with the challenges of today. Areas where one country operating alone is not able to address the challenges of climate, is not able to address the challenges of cybersecurity, is not able to address the challenges of the economic disruption that we've seen as a result of the pandemic. So what we are looking for, and I say looking for rather than expect, is partnership, an openness to finding new and better ways to work together, and also a willingness to be candid, to make clear what our respective views are. And we recognize that we will not always agree, but to look for ways in which, by working together, we can all be stronger at dealing with the challenges that we face.
Thank you, Mr. Kagan. Now, I have this question, and it's on the Quad. You talked of working together, right? The Quad is the latest piece of security architecture in the region. It brings together the United States, Japan, India, Australia. And the Quad talks about diverse perspectives, but yet it emphasizes that the members they are united in a shared vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, and striving for a region that is free, open, inclusive, healthy, anchored by democratic values, and unconstrained by coercion. Now, if the Quad's vision is one of inclusiveness, why is the Quad separate from the free and open Indo-Pacific, which says it's open? Why do you need the Quad?
I think a couple of things. I mean, first, I think it's important to look at the history of the Quad. The Quad emerged organically. The Quad emerged in a common response to the 2004 tsunami. And I think that it's really important to recognize that this was not something where there was a great idea that was waiting to be implemented. This was suddenly a recognition that there were 4 countries that were working in parallel. Suddenly we realized we would be more effective if we were able to work together. Now, that led to greater discussion, and there was an effort that was largely driven actually by Prime Minister Abe when his first time in office to create a slightly more formalized structure. But I think it's also important to recognize that even then, and still now, the Quad doesn't have a letterhead. The Quad doesn't have a formal institutional structure. The Quad is about 4 countries who are like-minded, though I think it's fair to say, and that will be a surprise to no one here, they don't agree on everything. But it is about trying to find ways to work together to deal with common challenges. It is not separate from the Indo-Pacific. It is part and parcel of the Indo-Pacific. And I think that the Quad's approach is one that is very much driven by pragmatic, practical considerations, trying to find solutions to problems and ways in which, by working together, we are more effective. The Quad recognizes the centrality of ASEAN. The Quad recognizes the importance of the relationships that exist throughout the region. So I don't think that it's fair to say, and I certainly don't think it's accurate to say, that the Quad is somehow separate from. The Quad is very much integrated into the region.
Thank you. I have a question for Phil, and it is, do you expect the Quad to expand to include other East Asian states?
I don't think there are any current additions on the horizon, but consistent with the theme of openness and inclusion that we've just been discussing, it's certainly not a closed door. And I wouldn't be shocked if it evolved to the point that others join this conversation.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, where there are some countries that have expressed some interest in it. There are no concrete plans right now to expand it. But because some countries share interests with the Quad countries, down the road, it's quite possible that not only will we coordinate, but we'll also consider different arrangements. But I absolutely agree with Edgard and Phil. Even though the Quad is distinct, it's actually quite complementary with ASEAN and the goals of ASEAN, and shouldn't be seen as competitive or a threat or anything like that. I really do think that because the Quad is really based on, or the foundational principles of the Quad, like-minded countries, democracies, it can actually mesh well with ASEAN down the road, because there is overlap there, and we look forward to those opportunities.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because as you know, in ASEAN, once the Quad was established, and well, it was started, as you earlier pointed out, that it's had some history, but it's stepped up, with the foreign ministers meeting under the last administration, and there was a March meeting, a summit this year, and ASEAN countries are worried that they will be marginalized and that ASEAN centrality will not be observed, although in your statement you pay, if I may say, sort of lip service to ASEAN and ASEAN centrality. And you know that ASEAN countries are very concerned about not wanting to look exclusive. They don't want to, the organization, they will not be comfortable joining an organization that is against any power or any country. So how would you bring ASEAN into the work of the Quad, or do some programs with the Quad?
I think that the first point is that the Quad is not against anyone. I know that there is a widespread view that is what's driving it, but I think that, again, it goes back to what led to the Quad's initial genesis and what the Quad has been doing since then, and particularly if you look at the March summit. I mean, the March summit focused on very tangible, real-world problems of today, including the vaccine announcement, which we are making progress on to deliver 1 billion doses of vaccine, to expand production capacity to produce an additional 1 billion doses of vaccine, but also to look at supply chains, to look at climate. This is something that I think is an expression of the fact that the Quad is about results-oriented, tangible solutions. And I think that the ability to work with ASEAN, I'm not sure that there will necessarily be a formal relationship between ASEAN and the Quad, but the Quad countries all have very long-standing and very close relationships with ASEAN. So I think that the idea that somehow there's a competition or that one undermines the other, in my view, is not accurate. And I think that you can see, I mean, perhaps you view it as lip service, but I think that as a practical reality, the Quad members all share an understanding and a vision of why ASEAN centrality is very much in our common interest. This is not something where we are paying lip service to it, but we recognize that we are all better off in a region that accepts as one of the norms the importance of ASEAN centrality.
Thank you. Would anyone else want to say anything? Well, I did notice that in the March summit statement, there was an emphasis on public goods, the delivery of public goods, good term, and something that countries in the region can share. And you mentioned vaccines, it was vaccine supply chain, climate change, and I think the other area was technologies, critical and emerging technologies.
Please.
Yeah, and I think in that respect, yes, there's room to work. It's a question of whether the Quad, as you say, is not an organized entity in that way. I guess we work bilaterally, and you have to work with ASEAN. And I would encourage the United States to work with ASEAN on these matters. And having heard the Vice President on trying to tackle the major pandemic challenge. How do you stop the next virus? How do we put our minds together to understand the evolution of the variants and so on? I think that's something that all the countries in the region would really want to partake in, and leadership on that front would be welcome.
Indeed, Ambassador, that's the point I wanted to make. I think it's really consistent with or derives from the point the Vice President made in her speech about the need for partners in tackling these new challenges. Everybody knows about our bedrock security commitments in the region, and they should remain front and center, and they're hugely important, and it should be a given, and we want to reinforce them. But I think her point about that was, even as we do that, if you think about the future of the world, the cybersecurity threats, the climate crisis, the pandemic, those are really big challenges too. And we realize, I think it's a core theme of the Biden-Harris administration, that we need partners and engagement to deal with such threats, unless you think somehow we can deal with these things alone, which we don't. And so when you need partners, you look for partners that can contribute. It relates also to your earlier question when you noted that this trip was also about sort of deliverables in these areas. Precisely the point. These partnerships are not just abstract, and they're not just security. We actually think we can do concrete things. Edgard mentioned the vaccine initiative of the Quad, and now here we are in Singapore taking practical steps on supply chains, pandemic, climate. So that's what we're trying to do to meet the challenges of the future.
Now let me step back and look at the bigger picture, ask a broader question. William Burns, who is head of CIA now, in his confirmation hearings, said the biggest threat to the United States is Beijing's goal to replace the U.S. in the world as the most powerful and influential nation. And Aaron Friedberg, he was in your position with Dick Cheney. He was the Deputy National Security Advisor to Mr. Cheney. And he said that recently, that it is a contest for supremacy now between the United States and China. Is this at the heart of U.S.-China relations? Anyone?
I can take a first shot at that.
Or tensions, U.S.-China tensions?
Yeah, I think that there's a tendency to want to find a catchy way to characterize the relationship. I think right now, as we boil it down to the sort of the basic elements, I think the Vice President put it really well, where we are going to make sure that we are promoting a rules-based international order, a free and open Indo-Pacific. I mean, these are the kinds of things that they are foundational principles for us when we deal with the world. And so when I heard, for example, the Secretary of State talk about our relationship with China, he said it very well, I thought, where, we are going to compete when we should, and we are going to cooperate when we can, and sometimes there will be an adversarial relationship, and we will defend our interest when we must. And I think that we're at that point now where the relationship has matured to a certain extent, where we're finding there are more areas of competition, and there are going to be times when it is adversarial. And I think that you've seen in the last few months, since the early days of the Biden-Harris administration, that we will defend our interests. The United States will defend our interests. And I think that in this region, I realize what our friends tell us about not wanting to choose one over the other. And that's not what we are asking countries do. We are not pursuing a kind of adversarial relationship like others have contended. That's not what we're trying to do. We are, in fact, trying to build coalitions of like-minded who believe in a rules-based international order. And we think that our presence here for many decades has really protected this region, made it possible for this region to grow and to prosper. And I think that, as many of you realize, the growth of China in this most recent period of reform and opening up has a lot to do with this rules-based international order that we constructed, and that we helped construct with all of you in Southeast Asia. So I think right there, even though there is this, I go back to my original point, everyone's trying to find some kind of pithy way of characterizing the relationship. But I think those foundational principles, that's where we are today.
It's not a secret to you, but the region is watching this increasing the increasing tensions and exacerbation in the relationship. And we hope ASEAN certainly hopes the United States and China will find a new equilibrium. Your previous secretaries of state have said, the Pacific is big enough for two powers, We don't want a Cold War, nor do we want to see a hot war. Some strategic thinkers have come up with different ways of, characterizing a possible relationship. You talk of collaboration, competition, and, of course, confront as well. Kevin Rudd has talked of managed strategic competition, and Joe Nye has talked of collaborative rivalry. You are in the decision-making. You're in White House and the administration. Where do you see the equilibrium landing?
So I don't have a two-word, one adjective and one noun description of the relationship between the United States and China, nor will I disagree with Bill Burns' statement, even if we want us to disagree with each other. But I think we reject the notion that conflict is inevitable. I mean, there are lots of academic, Thucydides' trap, rise of China, we're destined to clash. I don't think that's our view. I mean, as Ken explained, we have a positive agenda in the region. There are differences with China that are differences of principle and interest, and we have to be clear about that. But we're not looking for a new Cold War. Most of what we're trying to do in the region are positive relationships with these partners for the reasons I said before about getting practical things done that in many ways have little to do with China. We still, the pandemic issue and supply chains and climate are interests that we just have to pursue with our partners. So as policymakers, we have to do everything we can to pursue those interests while avoiding the sort of conflict that I know people in the region are worried about, which would suit nobody.
Any others? Yes, Mr. Kagan.
The only thing I would add to that is that it's important to recognize that much of this is about behavior, and that what we have seen are some very significant changes in behavior. And I think that be it along the border with India, be it in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, across the Taiwan Strait, these are all places where I think that the concerns that we, but not just the United States, many other countries in the region have to do with the behavior. And so I think that the idea that conflict is inevitable, I agree completely with Phil and with Ken. We certainly don't see it as inevitable, but we do feel that competition is important, and that part of that is being very clear about what we are for, not what we are against. And I think that we are very aware countries don't want to choose, and I think you heard the Vice President say, we're not asking countries to choose. We want to strengthen the relationships, the partnerships, the alliances that we have in the region by working together for with common purpose to achieve important and I think shared objectives that are necessary and require cooperation. And I think we have done that for a long time. I think that will continue. Countries have had questions about the United States in the past, but I think that what we have shown very consistently is we understand where our interests lie, and we understand that today, and our interests lie in strengthening our relationship with an Indo-Pacific that is increasingly at the center of geopolitics, but also that will be the major driver of economic growth in the world for the foreseeable future.
Right. Now, we're running out of time, so in the last 5 minutes or so, let me ask a question on trade. I know this word in Washington, everyone is allergic to the word trade, but Asia is about trade and business, And so I would like to ask this very esteemed panel, how do you make the argument that trade and investment, trade is strategic? The idea that trade is strategic. And that is why the United States has to engage in trade more openly, but it doesn't seem to get across. So how would you like to respond to that?
I think Americans understand the importance of trade. The Vice President talked about the billions or trillions of dollars that flow back and forth. The United States has prospered from the fact that most of the people who buy our products are outside the United States. So it's not really, and if you look at public opinion polling as well, you see strong support. So I think you can overstate it to somehow think that we don't appreciate trade. Where new trade agreements are concerned, I think the president has been pretty clear that his primary focus coming in was to get the United States economy moving again, which he's doing, and we're now growing faster than we have for 40 years, and that any new trade agreements that we might reach with other countries, and there's a lot of talk about that here, would have to ensure that labor be at the table and the environment be on the agenda. And the reason for that is not that we don't understand the value of trade. Again, we thrive in a world where we have trading relationships, but because it would have to be sustainable. And that, I think, is the key point. If it's not sustainable, not supported by the American people, there are all sorts of spillover consequences from that. So that's the reason that we're not pursuing new trade agreements now, but it's not somehow that we don't appreciate the fact that we thrive because of our trading relationships with our partners.
So is a digital trade pact on the horizon or somewhere distant between the U.S. and ASEAN? I know you are security people and foreign policy people.
Look, there's been a lot of discussion about it. It has become a much more frequent topic of conversation. I think there's a lot of interest. As Dr. Gordon said, anything that we will be doing will be done very much from the standpoint of first getting our own house in order. Dealing with COVID, restoring growth in the United States, and then looking very carefully at making sure that whatever we do does support workers in the middle class. I think that there are ways potentially of doing this, and I think that's something that we are studying and obviously talking with our partners and friends. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize, just going to your original point, the U.S. markets remain extraordinarily open. The idea that trade is something that somehow requires, further commitments, further obligations, I totally understand why people believe that. But the truth is, the U.S. remains one of the most open countries to trade in the world, and Americans understand the importance of competition. And we are very confident, as the president has said, we believe that we can compete, and we're confident that we will.
I'll just provide a specific example. I think when the president has talked about investment in clean energy, renewables, if you will, he thinks about it not just in terms of climate change, he's also thinking about jobs, right? And that's I think that's an example of where you look at trade possibility, especially, in regions of the world where renewables are possible and desirable. But also it's a strategic issue, too. We all know, just in the last few weeks, reading about all sorts of natural disasters around the world, that these are strategic issues that we are facing down the road. I think the Vice President has talked about the most recent UN report about climate change and rising temperatures and what that effect will be on populations and movement of populations and all of those effects. Those are strategic issues. And so there is, I think, an overlap, a very, very profound overlap between trade and strategic issues.
Thank you. Well, last question. We have 1 minute. What would the Vice President's key takeaways from the Singapore visit be? Phil?
And I have 50 seconds. I think about the importance of the region in Singapore to the United States. Now, it's not that we couldn't brief her on that in advance or she would read about it. These are things you understand, but there's nothing like coming to a country, engaging. She met the Prime Minister, the President. She's doing a supply chain roundtable as we speak to really fully understand and internalize the importance of this region to the United States. You have to come here. So I think that's the takeaway, that consistent with this theme of partners, to thrive in this world, we need important partners, and Singapore is certainly among them.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for saying that, Mr. Gordon. And I want to reiterate here as we end that we really feel very honored and we're very happy, we're glad that the Vice President chose Singapore as the first stop in her Asian visit. And as we all know here, you know, the great American philosopher Yogi Berra said, 90% of success is being there. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're glad as well. Thanks very much.
Our panel moderated by Singapore's Ambassador Chan Heng-chi. A range of questions looking at the depth of U.S. commitment to the region, what Washington wants from this region, and what Washington will give in terms of economic engagement, as well as function of the quadrilateral security dialogue. Stay with us. Plenty more still ahead on this bulletin.
Thank you for attending today's event.